Hello, everybody. I'm here in the Keller Room at NEC recording notes for our concert of November 4th of this year. So I think the first thing for me to say to everybody is it's election eve, and all of us have a civic duty to vote on the 5th. So please do. Whatever your politics, whatever, the most important thing to remember is that's our duty. Our concert tonight starts, as did last month, with a wonderful work by Johann Sebastian Bach, who came to a new job in Leipzig in 1723. Took the job because it was promising for him. He was an ambitious man who was always looking for something better. When he arrived, he was the cantor or the charge of religious music at two churches, most famously the St. Thomas Church, but also the St. Nicholas Church. And in addition to that, he had the duty of managing a school at the St. Thomas Church for young boys who were being trained in music. That was a big job, a lot to do. And almost from the beginning, he had a lot of frustration because the city officials of Leipzig were not very supportive of things he felt he needed to do a good job. There was renovation needed at both churches. He actually gave over part of his salary to somebody else to do a lot of the teaching of the boys. He had a big family, increasing in size. Ultimately, he was the father of 22 children, some of whom died in infancy. But when he came to Leipzig, he was hired primarily as a composer of religious music. And he did that over the period of time, but always with fights with the civic officials of Leipzig. So it's no wonder that when an organization that had been started some years earlier by the German composer Telemann at the university called Collegium Musicum, that he jumped at the chance to run it. Because this was independent of the city. This was a place where he could compose or ask other composers to provide works to be done, both instrumental and vocal, of a non-religious nature. And he used that from, I think it was in 1729 that he came to that. So that was 6 years after he came to Leipzig. And it was a particularly appealing place to him because, like our institution, the university was full of eager young people who loved music, wanted to sing in a chorus, wanted to do whatever they could do. And in that setting, it inspired Bach to write some wonderful music himself of a non-liturgical nature. And he had a good chorus there from the young people, and I think the operative things were that for all of those young people, nobody was paid, and there was no fee charged to them. I am sure he had a salary for doing this, but otherwise it was a completely voluntary operation. What's very interesting is that where these concerts took place was a coffee house, and it was run by a man named Gottfried Zimmermann. So it was known as Zimmermann's Coffee House. And It was famous because it was on a beautiful street in Leipzig, a very, very beautiful Baroque building, and a place where people could come. There was no admissions charge for this. It was open to men and women. The only thing that's kind of interesting is that the women were not allowed to drink coffee. And in fact, during that period of time, Bach wrote a piece, a cantata, a piece with singing, called the Coffee Cantata, which made fun of this situation. Now, Zimmermann himself was a pretty good businessman. So having given access to his premises for free and no admission and no pay for anybody to be involved, he didn't end up badly, because when the concerts were over, the men could come and drink coffee, and he made a lot of money from doing that. But in any case, around in that period of time, fairly into his tenure there, which was not terribly long, he wrote a piece for 2 flutes, traverse flutes, that's the kind that are played this way, not recorders or Blockflöte that way, with continuo. Continuo meant there was a bass line being played by a cellist and a harpsichord. And this piece, in 4 movements, is what we're going to hear in this concert. It was also something very common in Bach's time, that he would repurpose music he had written and use it in other works. A lot of composers have done that. In any case, I grew up playing on cello one of the compositions Bach had written for the now not common instrument called the viola da gamba. Gamba means legs. It was a flat-backed instrument, and it had a completely different sound, and it had more strings, and he wrote this same piece. And I'm not 100% sure which one came first, but they're both from the same period. He wrote this piece in G major. And it is a piece of such joyful, friendly music. It's in 4 movements, alternating slow, fast. And it is something that really starts our program off on a very, very positive, happy note. And that's about all you need to know about it, except when you're drinking coffee, think about Zimmermann and Bach. The middle work of our program is by a very, very wonderful and interesting composer named Rebecca Clarke. She was born in London, England in 1886 of an American father and a German mother. And she was interested in music from an early age, and first of all went to the Royal Academy of Music as a young college-age person, from which she was removed because one of her theory teachers proposed marriage to her. So the father yanked her out of that school, and after a while she transferred to another great institution in London called the Royal College of Music. The first one was Royal Academy of Music. And it's there that she started to study composition. Women composers were extremely rare. And she had a very famous teacher named Charles Villiers Stanford. She was, I think, the only woman composition student of him. And he admired her for her talent, but at the same time thought it was not going to be an easy career choice as a woman to be a composer. That, in fact, in spite of her huge gift, turned out to be the case. So he advised her to take up the viola. She had been playing the violin, the viola, which is, the middle voice of a string quartet, with the same tuning octave higher as the cello, A, D, G, C. And he sent her to study with another faculty member of that school named Lionel Tertis. For those who know anything about the history of viola as a solo instrument, you certainly know that name. Lionel Tertis was a Londoner, was Jewish. His father was a cantor at a synagogue there, and he took to the viola and had a very, very interesting career there as a violist, playing all kinds of music that he commissioned for that instrument, and also experimenting with the shape of the viola, which was never completely settled. And in any case, she became a really fine viola player. With that, she was able to be permitted, as a woman, rare, to join one of the orchestras in London. And in that particular group of people and at school, she met other women musicians and formed a string quartet with them, which endured particularly with the cellist May Mukul for many, many years. But she really had a hunger to be a composer. Because Clarke's father was American, and by the way, they didn't get along very well, but it was her father. She went back and forth very often between London and America, mostly New York City. In this country, at that time, there was a very wonderful woman named Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, who was a great, passionate lover of chamber music. And she had competitions to give a prize and a chance for performance, both of which are important to us musicians. In 1919, Clarke had written a wonderful piece for viola and piano. And she submitted that, understanding that women composers were not really fashionable or believed as worthy. She submitted this piece under a different name, a man's name. I think there were 72 compositions that were offered in this particular competition, and there was a tie for first place between that piece, the sonata for viola and piano, and a suite for viola and piano written by now well-known composer Ernst Bloch. It was found out that actually the composition of the sonata of Rebecca Clarke was from a woman, that actually Coolidge gave the first prize. It was a tie to Ernst Bloch. This, of course, was very, very upsetting to her, because people didn't believe that a woman could write music at that level. We don't think about that much anymore, although it's always still an issue. But I mean, there are so many wonderful women composers as women conductors, and the whole thing has opened up. 2 years later, she submitted another piece, a trio, that is for violin, cello, and piano. And it didn't win the prize, and I'm not sure whether it was tied for first, but it didn't win. In any case, I had always known about the sonata that she wrote. It's a very beautiful, very, very beautiful piece. And I had never before, about 6 months ago, even known that she had written this trio. And I found myself at the end of last May at the Perelman Music program, and I was assigned to coach it. I thought that was, well, that's interesting. I don't know this piece at all.
Sure.
I listened to some recorded performances of it on YouTube, and then I started to work with a very, very fine young piano trio from Juilliard. And the more I heard this piece, the more I was convinced that this 1921 trio is a masterpiece. When I came back to start to work on putting our programs together for this year, I wanted very much to do that piece. And I had two great players from our institution, one Pei-Shen Lee, pianist, and another Ki-Hyun Kim, who's a member of the Parker Quartet, who graduated from this school. And I didn't have a violinist, and I thought about it a lot, and I ultimately turned to the violinist I had worked with at the Perelman program, whose name is Christina Nem, and it turned out, as I learned, that she was a student at Juilliard of Donald Weilerstein, who teaches at both schools. So I offered her a chance to come and play it. So a few words about this piece. It's very modernist for its time. 1921 is a very important period of time. Some people think about it as the Roaring '20s, but it's close enough to the end of the First World War that for somebody whose parents were German and American, must have been something to think about. The piece begins with a very, very strong hammer blow motto of 5 or 6 notes, which recurs as a motive, something not exactly a melody, all through the 3 movements of the piece. And the piece is modernist in that it is thinking a little bit about where she had, when this was written, it was, Ravel was still alive, Debussy had died a few years before, and there was a lot of interest in the Impressionism that we associate with those two great composers. So that influenced her. But another thing in the piece that caught my attention is that there is, in the second thematic area of the first movement, something that sounds like a bugle call. I grew up knowing that in the army there was something that sounded dum bum ba-da-dum bum bum ba-da-dum bum bum ba-da-dum bum ba-dum. Wake up, wait, time to wake up. It isn't exactly that she quotes, but it's sufficiently close to that there is in this piece an overtone, or an undertone I should say, of reaction to the world that she lived in and she was part of. The rest of the piece is, the second movement is very impressionistic and lyrical. The third movement has a lot of the material again from the first movement, and the piece ends very passionately. So a little bit more about her. She was successful as a viola player. She was, somehow or other, her career was mostly either in London or out of New York. And ultimately, she lived in New York and found that while some of these early pieces had been published, how can a composer survive unless the music is, after it's written down, published? So she tried very hard, and she wrote a lot of music, to be sure. She wrote a piece for cello and piano as well, but kind of lost hope when a publisher could not be found to publish her music. And for a long period of time, she didn't write music anymore. Off and on she would come back to it, but somehow or other it had lost her attention. She had lost kind of hope. Why should I write music? Nobody will hear it. Well, that's changed somewhat, because after she died in 1979 at the age of 93, just at the year 2000, a Rebecca Clarke Society was founded, which still exists and has been searching out manuscripts of her pieces and getting them played and published and heard. And so her story is frustrating and concerning and sad, but somehow or other it has turned out not as she had hoped, but has turned out well for all of us, because the interest in her music and my ignorance not to know the piano trio that we're hearing today was inexcusable, I would say. Because there it is, it's a great piece. And here we have a chance to hear it performed. I've told you that when possible, I like to celebrate composers' birthdays or anniversaries. In the concert in October, we celebrated 100th anniversary of the death of Gabriel Fauré, great late 19th century French composer who died in 1924, exactly 100 years ago. In this concert, we're celebrating one of the titan figures of composition in the world of modernism, none other than Arnold Schoenberg, born in Vienna in 1874. So it's 150th birth year of Schoenberg. His story is fascinating and complex. He was born to a family in Vienna, I would say a middle-class family, Jewish in origin, who, if you're in Vienna and you're middle class, you know about classical music. And so I think that he grew up aware of that, but with nobody in the family initially going in that direction. He did start playing the violin as a young man. It was a perfectly fine thing to do. And he actually, from the beginning, as we've noticed about various composers, they have an urge to express themselves in a new way. His first pieces came when he was 9 years old. Okay, juvenilia, you would say, not important, not big pieces. And he wanted to learn a little bit about structure. He was very attracted to the music of Brahms, this full-bodied instrumental music, or music of all sorts, from the great composer who was living in Vienna when, in his early years. Brahms died in the mid-1890s. And he got friendly with a young man named Alexander von Zemlinsky. And Zemlinsky was a composer and somehow or other struck up a friendship with Schoenberg and began to share ideas with him about sonata structure, harmony, things like that. And Zemlinsky really was the first stimulus to Schoenberg's growth as a composer. The music he wrote was obviously based upon what he heard. And what he heard was Brahms, and then in that late Romantic period, eventually he heard music of Mahler. So the piece from our program is one of his famous pieces, and what's famous about it is that later on, Schoenberg was known as a 12-tone composer. Schoenberg was not writing in that style at all. He was writing in an extended version of the tonal world in which he lived. And in 1899, so still a young man, 25 years old, he wrote a piece that we are hearing tonight called Verklärte Nacht, means transfigured night, based upon a German poem by a poet named Richard Demel. And the poem is getting a little bit into what's happening in Viennese society, which is loosening up in terms of modernism and all. It's the story, the poem, about a young man who falls in love with a woman and learns that she is already carrying the fetus of another man. But as they say, love conquers all. It goes through into the forest and whatever, talking about how the night comes and everything is changed, because that is something the young lovers accept. This is a long piece, about half an hour long, of great richness and great adventurousness in the tonal world, and yet solidly in that place. And that's what we're going to hear tonight. But I do want to go on to tell you the story more about Arnold Schoenberg. Schoenberg got increasingly, after writing some very, very big pieces, Gurrelieder and mammoth pieces, that was what was happening in music at the end of the 19th century, as Mahler was writing symphonies and also Bruckner was writing symphonies. They were 55, 60 minutes long pieces. And there was kind of a spirit of where too much is too much. And he began to fool around with writing music that was not exactly the tonal upbringing he had had, which we would loosely call atonal, meaning not tonal, and yet it had tonal roots. And in that period of time, he wrote pieces that really, for piano, first of all, they were absolutely atonal, and he was searching for some way to organize his music. We grow up in the common era of the legacy of starting with Bach and going through Beethoven, Mendelssohn, Schumann, Brahms, in which there is a through line of taking the models of your predecessor and enlarging upon them. He wanted to do something different. And in 1921, he announced that he had found a new way of writing music. And I should back up a little bit by saying that all of his life, Schoenberg was a teacher. And so in 1904, then two very great young budding composers became his students. and those are names that we know and revere today. Alban Berg and Anton Webern. And he wrote a book about harmony, which he said, because he was their teacher, that he learned from them in teaching. This idea about composition continued through his whole life. He was teaching composition and he went to Berlin later, but in any case, in 1921, he said he had found a new way of writing. And this is what he called composing with 12 tones. Now, just a small explanation about that. If you go and sit at a piano and you start with C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, and so forth, there are 12 different pitches before you come back to C. And his idea was that you would write a series of using each of those notes once in whatever way you chose. And that could be just the basis for the music you wrote, just as harmony of the tonic and the dominant was the fundamental building block of music in the 19th, from Bach on through the end of the 19th century. So he actually became totally intrigued by that, and in the 1920s wrote very, very important pieces in that style. Piano pieces, septet, which I played when I was a young man, chamber symphony, all of that stuff happened, and his life went that way. He had been teaching in Berlin for a while, where he got a lot of support from the German composer Richard Strauss, encouragement. Strauss was not in that direction at all. Strauss lived until late 1940s and always was a total composer and an opera composer primarily. But Schoenberg was part of that system. So then the great terrible event happened when in 1933 Hitler and the Nazis became masters of Germany. And one of the tenets of them was great anti-Semitism against the Jews. Anybody who had been teaching in Berlin or there who was Jewish lost their jobs immediately. And most of them did their best to get out of Germany to save their lives. Schoenberg came a little bit to Paris for a while, but then found himself here in Boston, where he found a teaching job at something called the Malkin School of Music. He wasn't here very long, but he did then finally move to Los Angeles, where he lived the rest of his life. And he taught first at University of Southern California, and then at University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA. And he was teaching there in his last years. 12-tone music became a very dominant influence on musical composition in the first part of the 20th century. And if you didn't write in that fashion, you were considered old-fashioned. We had songs by Samuel Barber on our October concert. Barber didn't write that way. And people said, oh, you're a very old-fashioned. He said, this is the music, this is who I am. So just one last vignette about it is that sometimes when you have followers, they are more rigid than you are as the creator. In 1948, he wrote a magnificent piece for string trio, violin, viola, and cello. I've played it in my life quite a few times. And it was 12-tone. He had had a heart attack in 1948, and actually he wrote the piece a few years later. What happened after that was that there were some, as a young person, people I knew who had been students of Schoenberg, and he was still writing, mostly 12-tone music, but not always. And I think he's famous for the line, there's still a lot of good music possible to be written in C major. He came back to it somewhat, and so I know from one of his students in Los Angeles that somebody had analyzed the string trio and said, oh, well, Professor Schoenberg, here you made a mistake because this note is not part of the row in the right order. And he was very upset with them. He said, no, but that's the note I want there. He berated them because it was his ear that was his guiding principle, and the 12-tone system was his structural thing, like tonic and dominant had been before. Well, enough about him. There's so much to say about him, and people know it a lot. People consider him a modernist, upset because his music is not the tonal period, but he changed the course of music very much by this 1921 invention of his. But of course, tonight we're going back to 1899 in a safe period of his time and playing a piece that is revolutionary in its own way for that time, but not 12-tone. And here it is for Clarke.